So this is our lecture about Mesoamerica and South America. And if you haven't figured out what Mesoamerica is, I trust this image will help you to figure it out. And then, of course, we have South America here. And especially we're going to focus on Peru because that was where one of the earliest civilizations was established. But I wanted you to know what the standard is, what the district says. So, of course, students will be able to compare. So I want you to keep in mind that you're going to compare a couple of things. The emergence or the coming out or the formation of advanced civilizations in Meso and South America with the 4 early river valley civilizations. So really, I want you to keep in mind that the point here, the most important thing you can get out of Meso and South America is I want you to compare them to what you've already learned, because you've already learned about all 4 of the early river valley civilizations. You'll notice, like I did in the standards, there's no memorize the significant figures or the significant contributions for Meso and South America. They just want you to really think about the comparisons you see between that and between what you learn now and the ones you've already read about. So as for those 4 river valley civilizations, this is a pretty awesome map. You should know, starting here on the left, those 4 river valley civilizations, we'll do them in the order we studied them. So we started there in Mesopotamia, and there you'll see Babylon. And you should remember we've got the Sumerians, we've got the Babylonians. This is where Hammurabi was, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, right there. Then we moved into Egypt, and I want you to pay attention to those bodies of water that you learned. We moved into Egypt, which centered around the Nile River. And then, of course, we studied ancient Indian civilization there with the Indus River and the Ganges River. There's Mohenjo-Daro on the map, nice, and Harappa. And then we traveled over to China, and you'll see there that first capital of China at Anyang, which they had established. So these, when they say the 4 river valley civilizations, these are what they're talking about. Now, one way that Meso and South America are different is that they were not established according to or next to specific rivers. So that's one thing you'll notice. But interestingly, they still developed in a really similar way. So to answer that first question of where Mesoamerica is Greek for middle. So we're talking about middle America. So when we're looking at the 2 Americas, North and South, we're talking about this middle area. This is, of course, the modern day central and southern Mexico, and then our Central American countries. We call these Central America now. We don't really use the term Mesoamerica too much, but those countries there. So this map shows you Mesoamerica. We're going to focus specifically on that first, and then we'll get into South. The question that scientists struggled with and they've recently come up with their theory for is how it was that people came to arrive in Mesoamerica. And the prevailing theory, the current prevailing theory, is that during the establishment of the Ice Age, we had glaciers, and the glaciers froze. And as you can imagine, when the water all gathers into ice form, the seas are going to fall, or the sea level is going to recede and decrease. And when the water recedes, think about the tide coming in and out. When the water recedes, more land appears. So we ended up with this dry land exposed between Asia, over here, it's Siberia up here in the Northeast Asia, between Asia and here we have Alaska. If it had never occurred to you how close they were, consider that they're really not terribly far apart. And during the Ice Age, when the water was all gathered up in glaciers, there was a land bridge here. There was something we call the Bering Strait, or a bridge of land. And this was called Beringia, or the Bering Strait. This is labeled clear exposed land. So the land that becomes exposed, this orange area, the land that becomes exposed when the waters recede. Nomads, and you know what those are, nomads from Asia, apparently, because you know how they are, they've always got to be moving, following their prey. So the theory is that they followed animals across this land bridge, and that's how they arrived in America. Now, you should be able to deduce that when the Ice Age ends, those glaciers are going to melt, and then the water is going to come back, and it's going to cover that. So that's why right now there is not a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, but at that time there was. Now, the Ice Age was also the hunting age. We talked about nomads, and even when they came to America, they were still on the move in search of food. As we remember, they were hunter-gatherers, so they gathered nuts and fruits, and they gathered roots. They did a lot of fishing, and most importantly, the men did the hunting, and they were hunting those animals. The massive prey, like we're dealing with really big creatures. I put an image for you there of bison, if you've never seen the bison that became extinct as a result of overhunting. The woolly mammoth, that mythical creature, that real creature that once existed. We, of course, have bones and proof of it, but it's no longer in existence now. Antelope, caribou, all of those things were the animals that they followed and they were hunting. The animals were, of course, good not only for meat, but also their hides or their skins were for clothing, and they were able to use certain parts of the animals for tools. So they really made their living off of these creatures. Many of those animals ultimately became extinct or no longer around because of overhunting, and then the Ice Age ending killed some of them off. So when we no longer had as many animals, fortuitously here, just like, or luckily, here, just like in other independent places, like Mesopotamia, they discovered agriculture. So about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago in the Americas, the agricultural revolution began. Now, the Americas were a good place for it because they had almost an ideal climate. They had a great climate, and they had especially great geography for farming. Their soil, you can see a picture of it there, is very dark, very rich. Remember how the Egyptians called their land black land? They called the area around the Nile River black land, and then the deserts that were on the two sides red land. Well, here's very black land, very rich soil, and the reason for that is because it's largely influenced by volcanoes. And volcanoes put out a series of minerals that cause the soil to be very good for growth. So I did put this image on here so you could see. I was like, how many volcanoes are there in Central America? There are a lot. These are areas that are major volcanoes, that either ones that are already active or potentially active. So thanks to these volcanoes, their geography was influenced in that they had this very rich soil. Their climate, they had those good, I should say spring, my bad. They had these great spring rains. They had much drier summers. And then they had the autumn rains, which refurnished the soil. Their crops largely were things we associate with the New World or the Americas: pumpkins, peppers, squash, gourds. Gourds are any of those larger vegetables with the thicker skin, and beans. So those were the crops we associated with them in the beginning. And then there was yet another revolution even within agriculture. Because remember, agriculture, they just realized, hey, we can use these seeds and we can grow our own food, and then we can settle down because we won't have to be chasing our food around, and our food isn't threatening to kill us. That big change that I was just talking about is the act of domesticating corn. Remember, domesticate, that's an important word. We usually think about, it's easier to think about animals. It's easier thinking about convincing a wolf to follow you around, and that's how we came to establish pets. But you can also tame a plant. You can change a plant in some way so that it's more useful for food. And that's exactly what happened with corn. Because now, if you remember from American history, I don't know how much in elementary, but we think about how the Native Americans and the Indians or the Native Americans had maize. And this was this corn that they shared with the Europeans that they hadn't experienced before. And the way we got that maize was, take a look on the left here. These are the gourds. I'm sorry. You see the pumpkin and then squash. Those were what they were known for. So on the left is what wild corn looks like. The earliest corn, before we began cross-breeding the corn, this is what wild corn looked like. So you can see that there are kernels, and this would be kind of good for food, but it would be a struggle to survive off of. But when they learned, largely by trial and error, they learned that they could cross corn or cross-pollinate the seeds of wild corn with other vegetables. They were able to produce larger corn that provided more food. And then, of course, this is our corn cob of today. This is our modern corn cob. But this all began with the earliest of Americans learning to domesticate corn. Now, this is a review. I'm going to be silent for 15 seconds. It's really hard for me, but I'm going to do it. And I want you to come up with it at least 3 ways. In your mind, I want you to come up with 3 ways how agriculture, that agricultural revolution, which we first talked about in Mesopotamia, I want you to think about how agriculture changes people's lives. So 15 seconds of silence. You think. Okay, let's see how you did. Did you get these? That now, instead of having to chase the food and having to move when it ran out, you had this constant supply of food that you controlled, the ability to settle in one place and therefore start building cities and larger groups and larger societies. And because farming is more, hunting, any able-bodied man had to be out and hunting to provide for his group or family or tribe. But with farming, not everyone is needed. You can have designated groups to farm so other people can start to form other jobs and specialize, which leads, of course, to there's people who are going to do art. You have people who are going to commit themselves to writing. You have artisans who are going to start creating other kind of specialized goods. Think about the jewelry that we see in those early civilizations. And then when people have free time and they're not constantly chasing and being chased by animals, they can start to think spiritually. And then we have the establishment of religion. But I want you to remember that all of this requires water. In order to be able to even have agriculture, you've got to have a constant supply of water. So that's why these civilizations all tended to grow up around river valleys. Now, the Mesoamerican are going to establish, or they're going to be on the ocean coasts and they're going to be on the Gulf coasts. So I want you to notice that. So there we have the first civilization. This is the first one that you need to know for this area. It's fairly important, the Olmec. Now, if you're like, where are the Aztec? Where are those Aztec and those well-known civilizations like the Inca and the Maya? Those are later. Those are after. They're AD, they're after Christ, they're much later, so you end up studying them later, probably in 8th grade, but 6th grade focuses, as always, on the ancient. So these were your really early civilizations in this area, the first ones we have records of, and that's the Olmec, and they were around in 1200 BC. They also, like I said, had those rich farming resources. It was really beneficial. Take a look at where they are. They are, of course, going to establish their core area right there is going to be on the water because you're going to need consistent water sources. There are rivers traveling through this area as well that they make use of, but they're especially going to establish themselves on the coastline. So think of we had Nubia, the Egyptians at times, they have certain resources, but they have to trade for other ones. So their salt that they had and beans that they had in their gourds and their farming, they are going to trade that for several objects. One of them is jade. They're going to use jade for jewelry. The artisans are going to build very beautiful jewelry for that time. And they're going to trade for obsidian. And obsidian, you'll see a picture on the next one, is this special glass created by volcanoes. It's volcanic glass. And they're going to use it for knives that are actually harder. They're not necessarily as effective as your bronze and then your ultimately up to your steel, but they're very, very effective, very sharp, and very hard. So they're going to create these nice knives out of obsidian glass. They did the Olmec, that earliest civilization. We don't know a whole lot about them, but we do know that they had pretty wide trading areas and they used their inland rivers for trade. But then as we saw with Mesopotamia and the city-states, and as we saw in a lot of places, they were in power until they weren't, until another group gain control through fighting. So with the Olmec, that's the most important things I want you to know about them. Here's another map which is fairly helpful. It gives you an idea of it. So see, I mentioned the Aztecs, which people tend to know really well when they think of the civilizations in Central and South America, but the Aztec Empire doesn't really hit its height until 1519 AD. So this yellow area is where the Aztecs were. This small area here is where the Olmecs were, their heartland. If you've heard about the Maya, of course, that green is where the Maya are. But I wanted you to have a concept kind of where things were. And those three materials I mentioned, jade, that greenish turquoise material or mineral, that they used to create jewelry. Here are some of those beads that they created. I mentioned how they used obsidian, that very sharp volcanic glass. They used obsidian for weapons. They created these beautiful and dangerous knives. And then hematite is another material that they used, another volcanic material that they used. And this was neat. I thought it was cool. They used it to create mirrors. It was one of those rocks that, those rocks that are so polished and they virtually are capable of reflecting you. So they use those for mirrors. The last thing I want you to remember about the Olmecs, which I think is just a cool fact, when you think about Mexico and when you start to study Mexico, one of the things you'll see that people tend to show are these big heads. They were these massive, I put the picture with the people there so you could see for comparison of how big they were. And look at how finely crafted and intricate the detail is. They made these out of a product called basalt, and it was another volcanic. Again, all of their products are largely volcanic minerals. They carved it out of the stone and they created these huge heads. And the neat thing about these, besides that they just look cool, when Europeans first encountered these, it was encountering these that made some of them think that there were giants, that giants had once wandered the earth. And this was their proof of it, that they had these massive heads as art pieces or projects. The Olmecs are another one. We don't know a lot about them because there are very few records because it's from so long ago, but this is one of the things that they have left behind that we do still have. Here are the trade routes. I want you to remember that the Olmec largely were successful traders. Remember that they had farming. That was a thing they were very good at and they had a lot of resources for, thanks to their geography, thanks to their climate, but they needed to trade for other materials, and they traded for obsidian and they traded for jade. So you can see some of they were trading fairly widely within Central America. Now I'm going to do part 2. I'm going to do ancient Mesoamerica and South America part 2, but this was the end of part 1. So make sure, go back through. If you didn't take good notes, go through and take good notes. Make sure you got the most important things. And I will see you in class. Bye.